All right, we will go ahead and start. It's 4:30. We will call this meeting, the Eufaula Planning Commission, to order. May we have roll call?
Mr. Dixon? Ms. Harris?
Here.
Mr. Savage?
Here.
Mr. Green?
Here.
Mr. Motley? Mr. McKenzie?
Here.
Mr. Cobb?
Here.
Chief Holmes?
Here.
Mayor Tibbs?
Here.
All right, everybody's received a copy of the minutes of the last meeting. If there's no additions, corrections, deletions, is there a motion?
Make a motion that the minute be received.
Second.
Ms. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Savage?
Yes.
Mr. Green?
Yes.
Mr. McKenzie?
Yes.
Mr. Cobb?
Yes.
Chief Holmes?
Yes.
Mayor Tibbs?
Yes.
All right, do we have any communication from City Council?
No.
All right, moving on, hearing of applications, we have none this month. So we'll move on to other business. The first order of business is revision to the zoning ordinance, section 5.283, for uses on appeal for addition of funeral homes to the list. So if you will explain where we are and what we're doing with that.
Okay. Chairman Savage, I would like to take this moment to clarify some comments that I understand from different people of how the Planning Commission conducts business. And I would like to begin that with reading through our city's zoning ordinance as far as how public hearings and cases are heard by the Planning Commission. Okay. This is from Article 9 regarding amendments of the zoning ordinance. Section 9.1, zoning amendment petition. The City Council of the City of Eufaula, that's the City Council, may amend, supplement, change, modify, or repeal regulations, restrictions, boundaries of districts, or any provision of this ordinance. Okay, and it goes on to say, no such amendment shall become effective unless such first be submitted for approval, disapproval, or recommendation by the Planning Commission. Furthermore, it says the Planning Commission, upon its own initiative, may hold public hearings. Public notice of such shall be given for the consideration of any proposed amendment to the provisions of this ordinance. And then report its approval, disapproval, or recommendation to the City Council. So with that being said, what I have before you are two suggestions of the zoning ordinance. I will go through what I'm suggesting and what has been requested by various members of the public.
Okay, we're going to just address them one at a time.
We're going to address them one at a time.
Okay, there's two.
Okay, there's two. One you've heard before, that's regarding the buffer exception, but we'll touch on that once more. When I go through these, we will decide, or you will decide as a commission, whether you wish to have a hearing on this information. That would be to have a resolution passed by the commission to be then presented to the City Council, or you can simply say, we have no issues with this, we can recommend its approval to the City Council.
So we'll decide first of all if this is an issue big enough that would require a public hearing, because that is an option.
Yes.
Secondly, if we can have a recommendation that it go directly to the City Council as a recommendation for the change.
If you're comfortable with the language and you see no issues with it,
Right.
then we can go ahead and proceed to the City
And
Council
that's the
where it has
same
at least one public hearing. Okay.
The City Council would have a public hearing.
Yes, at
Right.
that moment
Right.
is when the public.
Okay, and we'll do that for both of these proposed changes.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. The first case regarding the issue of funeral homes, I have had an applicant come to me who wishes to have his funeral home located in a parcel that is currently zoned C1. The first request was to have it rezoned to C2. The issue with having it rezoned to C2 would be that forever and ever that is C2, and in this particular area, which we will discuss, it would not necessarily be appropriate for all C2 uses. The area we're talking about is the parcel that is immediately across from the hospital and from the school. It is, I believe, what was formerly a hospice care area. You that are familiar with this town better than I am know what that was once upon a time. So given that request, I took it upon myself to go through other ordinances and localities to see how they treated funeral homes. And I presented a chart in your staff report which basically explains how other jurisdictions handle this use. And you'll see that cities like Florence, Phoenix City, Eufaula, and Foley allow it by right in the same C1 similar use district. And cities like Athens, Auburn, Madison, and Montevallo alternatively have it by special exception or conditional use. Well, when I evaluated for our area and what and how we treat similar uses, how we approach cases that might not necessarily fit exactly, I thought that as going with uses permitted by appeal would be the best alternative, because then it allows that one layer of protection where another board can take a look at it, and it can be evaluated for such uses as the available parking, available access, water, sewer, all those criteria that any other special exception use permitted by appeal is required to follow. So that is my recommendation, that we allow the use as a permitted by appeal use in C1.
And that is to prevent from having to rezone to C2.
Correct.
We maintain the C1 in place, but on appeal, we can permit the funeral homes.
Correct.
In C.
And then appeal, of course, goes to the Board of Zoning Adjustment. And at that, they have a set of criteria they have to use
Right.
and establish whether that use is actually appropriate.
Okay.
So that's why we didn't go so much into the site itself as just explaining to you how we can provide for it in the ordinance, and it would further go under other scrutiny.
So the only actual change is what's highlighted in yellow, and you're taking out the hospital just because that should have been there in the first place.
Correct. It was an oversight.
And in that last page on that, uses permitted on appeal, hospitals were there in error, and so that's just fixing that. But funeral homes would be taken out of the uses permitted
And relocated.
and relocated to C1, which would be permitted on appeal.
Correct.
Now, it's not taking out, is it going to take out funeral homes permitted in C2?
Well, the way our zoning ordinance is constructed, whatever is allowed by right or by special exception in C1 automatically carries over to C2. So then it's...
So funeral homes can, is automatically carried over?
It's carried
Okay,
over to
okay,
C2.
okay, because that would just be redundant leaving it in there.
Correct.
Okay.
And you did say, though, that even if we simply recommended it, it will go to city council, and city council then is required to have a public hearing, so the
Correct.
public would have their say.
Absolutely.
How long would that take for that public hearing?
If we had a resolution to go, if you passed a resolution in the next planning commission meeting for it to go to city council, it would go to the next available city council docket. And they will have a hearing, and I believe they would have a second hearing the next 2 weeks. It has to be advertised consecutively for, I believe, 3 weeks. So we're talking at a minimum of 2 more months.
We could do that resolution today, though. Right?
We can, if you choose to do so. We
Right.
can pass a resolution.
We don't
for
have
it.
to wait until next planning commission meeting. We could send this as a recommendation today.
Yes.
Okay.
But your recommendation is send it to Board of Adjustments.
No, on an ongoing basis, if it goes through us and through city council, then this permit on appeal would need to go through the zoning board.
Correct. Any future use, any future funeral home that wanted to come through.
Right.
And that district would have to go through that same
Process.
exercise.
That other uses on appeal go through. I mean, you know, that's the same procedure. That other
It's an
uses on
established
appeal.
procedure. And in the zoning ordinance you have, in every district, you have a list of uses that are by special exception. And there's a section of the ordinance, it's section 8 or article 8 of the ordinance that outlines all of those parameters for each use and such.
Any other questions? Does anybody feel a need to make a motion to have a public hearing on this in the planning commission level?
No.
Okay.
Are we looking at possibly a funeral home going in that building on the corner in front of the school and the hospital?
Yes. But again, this is allowing that use of special exception, and there might be site issues and constraints that it has to follow. That's up to the Board of Zoning Adjustment to determine what other conditions it can place and how it would best fit in that area.
Right, this is not addressing that specific case, that was just what brought this issue up.
Correct. It would be a whole different ballgame if we were actually here trying to decide if this is going to be C2. We would be more focused on that actual.
So if we pass this, that don't mean we're gonna pass for a funeral home to go in that building?
Correct.
Right.
Right. They have to go through the whole process, they have to apply to the zoning board for the special exception,
Which is
Special
also a
use.
public hearing as well.
which is
So-
also a public hearing, so they would have to go through all of that.
In light of that, I recommend stay out of time.
You recommend that we recommend this to the city
Yeah,
council?
I recommend that we recommend it to the city council.
You move that we
I
recommend.
move that we recommend, yes.
All right. Do we have a second?
Second.
So the motion's been made and seconded that we send it to the city council as a recommendation.
Okay.
Roll call? I guess we roll call this, don't we?
Uh,
Yes?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Mr. Savage?
Yes.
Ms. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Green?
Yes.
Mr. McKenzie?
Yes.
Mr. Cobb?
Yes.
Chief Holmes?
Yes.
Mayor Tibbs?
Yes.
Okay, on to the other proposed change, revision to the zoning ordinance, exception regarding buffer requirements. So if you want to address that one also, and we have to make the same decisions on this one.
Correct. That same
Same,
discussion. Well, we have brought this, I've brought this to you in the last few months, and it just kind of went on the back burner because of other things that go on in the office, in the city. But what this is basically saying, right now, this section of the zoning ordinance says that the Board of Zoning Adjustment has the authority only to determine if an exception, and how to handle an exception to the buffer requirements. And we've had a couple of issues in the past where existing lots, non-conforming lots, we want to facilitate development. However, given that 30-foot, and if I need to go back into the background, I'd be glad to do so, but basically they have to have 30 feet there. The ordinance now states, well, the board can just simply say, okay, we'll just give you an exception for 15 feet. And it ends at that. It more or less is saying that an applicant has to go through this process, but it's more or less granted. It's a given. They're going to have an exception unless there's a really deep-seated issue where they're not allowed to have it. What the new ordinance would do is grant that authority to the zoning administrator and give the zoning administrator the availability to examine each site on a case-by-case basis, and without having that applicant to go through a month, to a process that can take months. Taking each site and evaluating its location, its adjacency to other uses, and what other mechanisms are in place to provide for a strong buffer. It can be in the form of a taller fence, a wooden fence supplemented by landscaping, or just a very thick landscape buffer, or can be variance of the width. These things that staff can effectively look at, to weigh, and make a decision on, and save that applicant that process that is just an exercise.
Thereby also, delaying construction
Correct.
and delaying money to the city.
Yes.
what things would not be staff approved? What kind of circumstance? I just want to be sure that something doesn't slip through that should not have slipped through.
If it was a very intensive use located next to a residential area, and it couldn't meet the performance standards. The performance standards are another section of the zoning ordinance that addresses a use and how any noxious odors, noise, glare, all of these things that can be negative impact on an adjacent property could be.
Can the zoning administrator flat out deny, or
The zoning administrator would be able to say, taking it to the planning commission.
Okay,
I
so
think
the zoning
there's language
administrator-
in there that basically states for new development that possibly would not be able to meet the performance standards, that they would take it to the
Right.
planning commission.
so what we're looking at is just the things that are pretty much are going to be almost automatically approved
Yes.
anyway.
Yes.
But if not, then at the zoning administrator review level, it is not flatly denied, it is just referred to planning commission.
Correct.
Okay,
The last sentence in that ordinance, which has not been changed, this is existing language. The planning commission may require more restrictive buffers for any development that is expected to generate excessive noise, light, odor, other nuisance, which is basically the performance standards that I just touched on a minute ago. For the benefit of the audience, I will read the actual excerpt that we're discussing. In the case of existing development on any non-conforming lot where the provision of the 30-foot buffer, 30-foot screen buffer precludes the reasonable use of the property, upon approval of the zoning administrator, a wall or fence at least 6 feet high, supplemented by vegetative screening, may be substituted. Plans for the design and construction of such wall or fence must be constructed along the designated property lines and maintained in good condition. And then it goes on to the portion where it says the planning commission may require more restrictive buffers.
okay. Now, is it clear in the ordinance how it gets to the planning commission? I mean, I'm not sure I'm reading this right. Let me look at it again.
Well, the whole project would have to be approved by the planning commission.
This is just for a buffer.
This is
Well,
just-
yes. Large-scale site plans can come through the planning commission regardless.
What's an example of a recent one maybe that we could refer to?
Well, I mean, I think two of them, and one of them is when Mr. Franklin's application came, and then also when the Dollar General, potential location on Lake Drive. Those are the two that I can think of that have come before the last.
Mr. Franklin, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah.
Mr. Franklin's case is what prompted staff to really look into this, because he did have to go through a lot of channels, and it was a very intensive restriction on that site, because sometimes ordinances don't necessarily address existing uses as well. It's really good at trying to plan for the future. But there are a lot of sites out there where this is an ordinance that came about, I think, in 2007, and you're looking at a lot of property pre-2007 that just simply is not going to make this requirement.
I think this upon approval of the zoning administrator kind of gets what I'm looking for, because upon, you may do this, but if not, then the planning commission may require more restrictive. Am I reading it right?
Well,
And if it's not clear enough, we can look at the language a little closer.
right, I mean, I think, anything that comes before the planning commission, the
But-
planning commission still reserves that right to require more.
Absolutely, yes, that's
But,
true.
but if it's not something that would otherwise come before the planning commission, then there's not a process in here for the planning commission to step in those applications that would not otherwise, because like, for instance, Mr. Franklin's, had he not, his wouldn't have necessarily come, because it wasn't a major development, he wouldn't have necessarily come before the planning commission, correct?
Correct.
And so if you just
It would've
take
gone to
that,
the zoning board.
it would have gone to the zoning, exactly.
Okay.
And so this would have eliminated, one more trip to the BZA that he would have not, he could have avoided if he could, because under the current, you have to have 30 feet. Well, there are a lot of lots in Eufaula that are potentially for development that are right next to residential, where there's no way they could ever have 30 feet
Right.
of buffering. between them and a residential use.
So what
I think
happens if
that's the-
something comes up? I'm just trying to think of what the what-ifs that might come up down the road.
Just have a non-appeal process,
Have what?
appeal process.
And the
An
what
appeal
ifs,
process?
the what ifs are taken care of by the fact that it has to come before the planning
Planning
commission.
commission.
Or we
That
could
takes
still,
care
we
of
could
the
simply
what-if.
state that at the discretion of the zoning administrator, any case can come before the planning commission for further review.
Or the
you know.
BZA or whoever, but that's what I'm thinking. Somebody comes to you and says, I want to use this provision for you to grant me, I just want to build a 6-foot wall and put some shrubs on it, and you look at it and you go, it's really not going to be enough in this case. So then what happens, I guess, is what I'm asking. The zoning administrator looks at it and says, well, you know, in this case, it's really not going to be enough. You know, and maybe that needs to be looked at. Then what happens? I guess that's my question. Then it goes to the BZA?
I think it could be addressed, I think we could write it to be addressed by the BZA. But when you come right down to it, if it can't, I mean, that's one of those cases where if it can't simply meet it, is if it's an existing business, do you want to say, okay, well, you just can't expand. There's just no way you can expand. Seems to me that you have to be able to come up with some kind of,
You gotta have the ability to compromise, because the way it's currently written, you know, there's certain minimums that it can't go under. And so it kind of boxes you in, and especially in the case of a lot that's an irregular, it's a small lot, like what we have in Eufaula for various commercial uses right next to residential uses. So,
Okay.
I mean, I definitely think there's a need for a change. Now, what the
Yeah,
change
and I-
would be is up to y'all.
And I think, you know, we need to, I think we have too many trivial issues coming before an entire board somewhere sometimes. That could be, I mean, we talked about this before in some of the hearing applications that we have that really have no issues. But that's something different, and that's sort of what this, kind of the same philosophy here, isn't it? Rather than putting the landowner through the process
correct.
and the BZA through the process.
Right. You want to be able to provide good customer service there. I mean, common sense solutions, you hear that. I mean, some of the things that right now the board has purview over are things that can be handled by
At the
staff.
staff level.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
They can certainly be done at the
Switch
administrative
pans.
level.
And
And
I-
no, we
I
can't
agree with
plan
that.
for every single scenario.
Right.
It's just impossibility to do so. But this is a step in that direction, so.
Anybody else have questions, comments? Motions?
I make a motion that we pass.
That we recommend it to city council?
I second.
Mr. Savage?
Yes.
Mr. Green?
Yeah.
Mr. McKenzie?
Yes.
Mr. Cobb?
Yes.
Mr. Holmes?
Yes.
Mayor Hughes?
Yes.
Ms. Harris?
Yes.
All right. So those two will go on to city council. And the next item that we have is election of officers. We have two officers, the chair and the vice chair. So, can you just open this for nominations?
Yes.
So we will open, first of all, for nomination for the position of chairperson.
I
Nominate.
nominate Mr. Savage.
I second.
I second it.
Oh,
You're never gonna get out of that.
This isn't a lifetime appointment, is it?
Just about.
Now, do we have to do a roll call vote on this, or just
It could be a force vote.
voice vote? All in favor?
Yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? Okay, Mr. Savage then is the chair for another year. The next would be for vice chair nominations.
I nominate Ms. Harris.
Second.
Lifetime appointment.
Y'all do
Made
an
and seconded.
outstanding job.
You do a good job.
Yeah.
All in favor?
Yes.
Any opposed? That was painless, wasn't it? So Ms. Harris is the vice chair. All right, we've got the December building report attached. Everybody's had a chance to look at that. Is there any other business? Then if there is none, then I will adjourn this meeting.